From Antoinette Frank, the former cop-turned-killer, to Christy Scott, who burned her autistic son for insurance money. Today, we're diving into America's most forgotten prisoners trapped in decades of solitary confinement. Antoinette Frank, the fallen officer who lost everything. Antoinette Frank has been on death row for over 29 years and has spent significant time in solitary confinement, including a 6-year stint at Angola prison. Born on April 30th, 1971, Antoinette Frank's life was marked by trauma from the very beginning. Frank grew up with severe physical and sexual abuse from her father, as detailed in legal filings. Despite her troubled background, or perhaps because the system failed to recognize the warning signs, Frank applied to the New Orleans Police Department despite failing psychiatric evaluations, hired during a crime wave in the early 1990s. The irony is devastating. A woman who needed help was instead given a badge and a gun, a decision that would prove catastrophic for multiple families. On March 4, 1995, Frank's life took a turn toward unimaginable darkness. She committed a violent armed robbery at the Kim Un restaurant in New Orleans, murdering Ha Vu, 24, Quong Vu, 17, and fellow officer Ronald A. Williams II, aided by drug dealer Rogers Lacaze. The brutality of the crime was matched only by the audacity of what came next. After the murders, she returned to the scene in a police car, pretending to help, but was identified by survivors. The psychological portrait that emerged during her trial painted a picture of a woman whose traumatic childhood had created vulnerabilities that were exploited by criminal influences. The robbery was motivated by financial gain, linked to her drug-related relationship with Lacaze, with her actions also influenced by her traumatic background, making her vulnerable to manipulation. For 30 years now, Antoinette Frank has existed in a world of concrete and steel, where she has spent most of her incarceration in solitary confinement, including a 6-year stint at Angola prison, enduring harsh conditions like extended lockdowns and no access to in-person classes. The woman who once walked the streets as a police officer now spends 22 to 24 hours a day in a cell, her world reduced to a space smaller than most people's bathrooms. Her legal battle continues even now. A New Orleans judge set a December 2025 hearing for Frank to fight her 1995 conviction and death sentence, indicating her case is still active. However, her clemency application was denied in 2023 by the Louisiana Board of Pardons, despite support from 50 anti-gender violence organizations citing her history of severe abuse. Perhaps most telling is the disparity in how justice was ultimately served. Her co-defendant, Rogers Lacaze, was sentenced to life without parole in 2019, while Frank remains on death row. While Frank's badge couldn't save her from a life in solitary, our next story follows another woman condemned to the same fate before she was even out of her teens. Krista Pike, the youngest woman on death row. Pike was convicted of torturing and killing 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer in 1995 and was in solitary confinement for nearly 28 years until a 2024 settlement allowed her more privileges. Born on March 10, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia, Krista Pike's early life was a textbook case of how childhood trauma can shape a person's trajectory in the most devastating ways. Pike endured neglect and abuse, with her parents having a volatile relationship and her own mental health issues, including severe childhood trauma. Her upbringing was marked by violence, sexual abuse, and substance abuse, a toxic combination that would later be cited as contributing factors to her eventual crime. On January 12, 1995, when Pike was just 18 years old, she committed an act of violence so brutal that it would forever change multiple lives. Pike, along with Tadarrell Shipp and Shadolla Peterson, tortured and murdered Colleen Slemmer, 19, at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, with Slemmer being beaten, stabbed, and strangled in a remote area. The motivation for this horrific crime reveals the disturbing psychology at play. Pike told a friend she felt mean that day, suggesting a spontaneous act of violence, but her untreated mental illness and childhood trauma likely contributed. This chilling explanation, feeling mean, speaks to a level of emotional disconnection and psychological damage that is difficult to comprehend. For nearly 3 decades, Krista Pike has been the only woman on Tennessee's death row, a distinction that has made her case particularly notable in discussions about capital punishment and solitary confinement. She is the youngest woman sentenced to death in the modern era, a fact that has raised ongoing questions about the application of the death penalty to young offenders. However, Pike's story took a significant turn in 2024. In 2024, Pike settled a lawsuit with the state, ending her nearly 3 decades of de facto solitary confinement, with the settlement granting her more privileges, including the ability to work and share meals with other incarcerated women. This settlement represents one of the few instances where prolonged solitary confinement has been successfully challenged and modified. Despite Despite this improvement in her conditions, Pike's situation remains precarious. The Tennessee Supreme Court ruled in 2025 not to hear her case challenging her death sentence, and she has pending requests for execution dates, but no date has been set. Her case continues to be a focal point for discussions about juvenile justice, as her attorneys continue to challenge her death sentence, arguing her youth, 18 at the time of the crime, and history of childhood trauma should be considered. While no longer in the strictest form of solitary confinement, she remains isolated as the only woman on death row, with attorneys noting she is adapting to new terms but still very isolated. While Pike spent decades in solitary, the next woman has been trapped there even longer. Patricia Blackman, the longest-serving woman on Alabama's death row. Our next case brings us to Alabama, where Patricia Blackman holds the devastating distinction of being the longest-serving woman on Alabama's death row, having spent over 23 years in what can only be described as a living nightmare of isolation and uncertainty. On May 29, 1999, a tragedy unfolded in Dothan, Alabama, that would forever change multiple lives and raise profound questions about child protection systems and the cycle of abuse. Blackman beat her 28-month-old adopted daughter, Dominiqua Bryant, to death, with paramedics finding Dominiqua covered in vomit and blood-soaked socks, and an autopsy revealing a fractured skull and broken ribs. The details of the crime paint a horrifying picture of sustained abuse. The child suffered multiple injuries, including a fractured skull and broken bones, and an imprint from a shoe on her chest. These physical findings told a story of prolonged torment that a toddler endured at the hands of the very person who was supposed to protect her. What makes this case particularly tragic is the context in which it occurred. Dominiqua was an adopted child, presumably removed from one unsafe situation only to be placed in another that would prove fatal. The crime suggests long-term abuse with no clear financial motive, but a pattern of neglect and violence toward adopted children. Since her conviction in 2002, Patricia Blackman has existed in the restrictive environment of Alabama's death row. While there is no specific information on her current confinement conditions, as a death row inmate, she is likely subject to restrictive housing. This means that for over 2 decades, she has spent the vast majority of her time isolated in a small cell with minimal human contact and limited access to programs or activities. Her legal journey has been marked by unsuccessful appeals. Her attorney argued in 2003 that the child may have been unconscious during the beating, but the appeal was denied. Since then, there have been no recent updates on her case since her conviction, with appeals exhausted. While Patricia Blackman's decades of isolation seem endless, the next case reveals a system failure that doomed another woman and her child to tragedy. Tierra Capri Gobble, a pattern of tragedy. Born on April 18, 1983, Gobble had a history of child abuse, with her first 3 children removed by welfare, yet she was somehow allowed to care for another infant who would become her victim. On December 15, 2004, a tragedy occurred that had been years in the making. Gobble killed her 4-month-old son, Phoenix Parrish, by striking him repeatedly, causing blunt force trauma to the head, with Phoenix rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead. The fact that this infant lived only 4 months speaks to the vulnerability of children in dangerous situations and the catastrophic consequences when systems designed to protect them fail. The background to this crime reveals a disturbing pattern that should have been addressed before it reached its tragic conclusion. Gobble's history of child abuse, with her first 3 children removed by welfare, highlights systemic failures in child protection. The fact that she was caring for Phoenix despite this history raises profound questions about how child protective services operate and how such situations are monitored. The motivation behind the crime appears to have been rooted in frustration and an inability to cope with the demands of caring for an infant. Gobble had a history of child abuse, with her frustration and neglect leading to Phoenix's death, despite warnings not to care for him. This suggests that the crime was not premeditated murder, but rather the culmination of a pattern of abuse that escalated to a fatal conclusion. During the investigation and trial, disturbing details emerged about the circumstances of Phoenix's death. Evidence showed prior child abuse and neglect, with Gobble admitting to hitting the child's head on the crib. This admission provides insight into the mindset of someone who saw violence as an acceptable response to infant behavior. For over 20 years now, Tierra Capri Gobble has been held on Alabama's death row. Her appeals were exhausted, with the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upholding her death sentence in 2010. Since then, there have been no recent updates since her 2005 conviction. Like the other women on this list, as a death row inmate, she is likely in restrictive housing, meaning she has spent 2 decades in near-total isolation. While Gobble has spent decades alone for the death of her infant, Graham's isolation follows a crime that shattered the very meaning of motherhood. Lisa Leanne Graham, When Family Becomes Enemy. Perhaps no crime strikes at the heart of our understanding of family bonds quite like that committed by Lisa Leanne Graham, who turned the most fundamental relationship, that between mother and child, into something deadly and incomprehensible. Her case represents a particularly disturbing example of how jealousy, mental illness, and family dysfunction can culminate in the ultimate betrayal. Born in 1964, Lisa Leanne Graham appeared to live a relatively conventional life until the events of 2007 shattered any illusion of normalcy. Graham had a close but troubled family dynamic, with court records noting her PTSD and schizophrenia diagnoses during sentencing. These mental health conditions would later be cited as contributing factors to her crime, though they would not save her from the death penalty. On July 5, 2007, Graham crossed a line that most people cannot even imagine approaching. Graham hired Kenneth Walton to murder her 20-year-old daughter, Stephanie Shea Graham, in Russell County, with Walton shooting Shea multiple times in a remote area and Graham providing the gun. The premeditated nature of this crime, planning and facilitating her own daughter's murder, places it among the most disturbing cases in the annals of criminal justice. The motivation behind this unthinkable act reveals the complex psychology of a woman whose mental illness intersected with personal jealousy in the most destructive way possible. Graham's jealousy and marital strain drove her, believing Shea was having an affair with her husband and was a troublemaker, including drug use and stripping. This distorted perception of reality, likely influenced by her untreated mental illness, led her to view her own daughter as a threat to be eliminated. The financial aspect of the crime adds another layer of calculation to what was already a deeply personal betrayal. The motive was reportedly to avoid financial loss from her daughter's bond, with evidence showing she provided the gun. This suggests that Graham's decision was not made in a moment of passion, but was instead a calculated choice based on both emotional and financial considerations. Since her conviction, Lisa Leanne Graham has spent over 10 years on Alabama's death row. Her conviction and death sentence were upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in 2019, effectively exhausting her appeals process. There have been no recent updates on her case since then. Like the other women on Alabama's death row, as a death row inmate, she is on restrictive housing. For a decade, she has existed in near total isolation, living with the knowledge that she orchestrated her own daughter's murder. While Graham's isolation stems from a mother's betrayal, the next woman's fate was sealed by the brutal deaths of 2 children under her care. Heather Leavell Keaton, the Mobile County First. Born in 1988, Heather Leavell Keaton became involved in what would prove to be a deadly relationship that would ultimately cost the lives of 2 innocent children. Leavell Keaton was in an abusive relationship with John DeBlaze since 2008, becoming the stepmother to his children. The dynamics of this relationship would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. Between March 4 and June 20, 2010, a horror unfolded in Mobile that would forever change how the community viewed child protection and domestic violence. Leavell Keaton and John DeBlaze murdered DeBlaze's children, Natalie 4 and Chase 3, poisoning them with antifreeze, duct taping them, and burying them in the backyard. The sustained nature of this abuse, occurring over months, speaks to a level of premeditation and cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. The triggering event for these murders reveals the disturbing psychology at work in this case. The murders were triggered by the children asking about their biological mother within a context of ongoing abuse, with evidence of starvation and torture. The idea that children asking about their mother could trigger such extreme violence speaks to the level of dysfunction and dangerous control issues present in this household. The methods used to kill these children demonstrate a level of calculation and sustained cruelty that stands out even among cases involving child murder. The use of antifreeze as a poison, combined with duct tape restraints and the concealment of the bodies, shows planning and deliberation that extends far beyond a momentary loss of control. Leavell Keaton's role in these crimes has been a subject of legal debate, with questions raised about the influence of her abusive relationship with DeBlaze. Her claims of DeBlaze's abuse were noted, but evidence showed her active role. This highlights the complex dynamics present in cases where domestic violence intersects with child abuse, raising questions about coercion versus willing participation. The legal consequences for Leavell Keaton were swift and severe. She was the first woman in Mobile County history sentenced to death row, a distinction that speaks to both the severity of her crimes and the rarity of women receiving capital punishment. Her appeals process has been largely unsuccessful. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected her appeal in 2023, leaving her death sentence in place, and there have been no further legal proceedings or updates reported. For 15 years now, Heather Leavell Keaton has been held on Alabama's death row. As a death row inmate, she is in restrictive housing, meaning she has spent a decade and a half in near total isolation, living with the knowledge that she participated in the torture and murder of 2 small children. While Leavell Keaton spends her years alone for a crime rooted in twisted family dynamics, Scott's isolation stems from one of cold calculation calculation, and maternal betrayal. Christy Michelle Scott, the insurance killer. The case of Christy Michelle Scott presents one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes on our list, where financial gain served as the motive for the murder of a vulnerable child with special needs. Her story represents the intersection of greed, callousness, and the ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility. Born on August 10, 1978, Christy Michelle Scott appeared to live a relatively normal life until financial pressures and personal resentments combined to create a deadly situation for her young son. Scott had two sons, preferring Noah over Mason, with her financial pressures and resentment toward Mason's needs driving her actions. This preferential treatment between her children would prove to be a crucial factor in the tragedy that followed. Mason Scott was not just any child. He was a 6-year-old boy with autism who required special care and attention. Rather than seeing this as an opportunity to provide love and support to a vulnerable child, Scott viewed her son's condition as a burden and an annoyance. Witnesses noted her cruelty toward Mason due to his autism, treating him as an annoyance. This attitude toward a special needs child reveals a level of callousness that is deeply disturbing. On August 16, 2008, Scott committed an act that was as calculated as it was cruel. Scott set fire to her home in Russellville, killing her 6-year-old autistic son, Mason, from smoke inhalation and burns. The method chosen, arson, ensured that Mason would suffer before dying, trapped in a burning house with no ability to escape or understand what was happening to him. The premeditated nature of this crime is revealed by Scott's actions in the days leading up to the fire. She had bought a $100,000 insurance policy the day before, demonstrating that this was not a crime of passion, but rather a calculated decision to murder her son for financial gain. The timing of the insurance purchase leaves no doubt about her intentions. The motivation behind this crime was starkly financial. Financial gain was the motive, with witnesses noting her cruelty toward Mason due to his autism, treating him as an annoyance. The idea that a mother could view her special needs child as nothing more than a financial opportunity speaks to a level of moral bankruptcy that is difficult to comprehend. The legal process that followed revealed the calculated nature of Scott's actions. The jury recommended life, but the judge sentenced her to death, a decision upheld on appeal. This judicial override demonstrates that even the judge found the crime so heinous that life imprisonment was insufficient punishment. Scott's appeals process has been lengthy, but ultimately unsuccessful. Her death sentence was upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in 2012 and by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015, and there have been no recent updates on her case. For over 16 years now, Christy Michelle Scott has been held on Alabama's death row. As a death row inmate, she is in restrictive housing, meaning she has spent nearly 2 decades in near-total isolation. The knowledge that she murdered her own special needs child for insurance money creates a psychological burden that, combined with prolonged solitary confinement, represents a form of suffering that extends far beyond the physical confines of her cell. While Scott's isolation stems from a mother's greed, our final case reveals how an entire family's culture of cruelty led one woman to a death row cell of her own. Samantha Allen, the family culture of abuse. Our final case brings us to Arizona and the story of Samantha Allen, whose crime represents perhaps the most systemic failure of family protection we've encountered. Her case illustrates how cultures of abuse can permeate entire family systems, leading to the torture and murder of the most vulnerable members. Born in 1988, Samantha Allen grew up in and later perpetuated a family environment where violence against children was normalized and extreme punishment was considered acceptable. Allen lived in an abusive household with her husband and mother, Cynthia Stoltzman, who also faced charges with her role in the family's abusive culture, leading to her conviction. This context is crucial to understanding how the murder of Amy Deal came to pass. Amy Deal was not just any child. She was a 10-year-old girl who was essentially trapped in a household where multiple adults participated in her systematic abuse. Allen and her husband, John Allen, locked the child in a plastic footlocker as punishment, leading to her suffocation. The fact that this was considered an appropriate punishment speaks to the deeply dysfunctional family dynamics at play. On July 12, 2011, what the family considered discipline crossed the line into murder in the most horrific way possible. Allen and John Allen locked Amy Deal, 10, her cousin, in a footlocker as punishment for taking a popsicle, leading to her suffocation in Phoenix. The trivial nature of Amy's offense, taking a popsicle, compared to the extreme nature of her punishment, reveals the shocking disproportionality that characterized this household's approach to discipline. The investigation revealed that Amy's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a sustained sustained pattern of abuse. Evidence showed prior injuries, with forensic evidence showing prior injuries, indicating that the family had been escalating their abuse of this child over time. The fact that Amy had been subjected to previous violence makes her final punishment even more tragic. The methods of abuse used against Amy were particularly cruel and degrading. Evidence of prior abuse included forcing the child to eat dog feces and walk barefoot in extreme heat. These forms of humiliation and torture speak to a level of systematic cruelty that goes far beyond typical child abuse cases. The motivation behind this crime appears to have been rooted in a twisted sense of discipline and control rather than any rational response to childhood behavior. The punishment was part of long-term family abuse, with no clear financial gain, but a disciplinary control motive. This suggests that the family viewed extreme violence as an appropriate way to maintain control over the children in their care. Samantha Allen's legal journey has been marked by unsuccessful appeals. Her death sentence was upheld by the Arizona Supreme Court in 2022, and there have been no recent updates on her case. For nearly 8 years now, Samantha Allen has been held on Arizona's death row. Allen is one of only 3 women on Arizona's death row, making her situation particularly isolated. As a death row inmate, she is in restrictive housing, meaning she has spent nearly a decade in near-total isolation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.